Hi. In this video, I'll be talking about the middle pages of Schopenhauer's essay on the sufferings of the world, which is the first essay in his volume Studies in Pessimism. But before I begin with that, I'd like to say a little bit more about Schopenhauer's anti-natalism. A commenter just a little bit ago suggested that I should say more about this. This is the topic with which Schopenhauer ended the previous section that I did the first video on. Suggesting that if human reproduction, if bringing children into the world were entirely a matter of will, if it were entirely within our voluntary control, people would have far fewer children. Schopenhauer suggests this supports his view that we all deep down know that there is vastly more suffering in the world than pleasure, that life on the whole is a kind of a mistake or a cheat, and that we would hesitate then to inflict existence upon other beings like ourselves if we were able to abstain from doing so. So that's certainly a very strong anti-natalist line, which may be, as my commenter suggested, a central pillar of Schopenhauer's thought. My own view on this, complete opposite. A hard pass from me on the anti-natalism. I'm strongly pro-natalist myself. I have 4 children. I have grandchildren now. I move in social circles with people who have more children than me, many of them. So I am, on the whole, pro-children, pro-babies, both in my own life and I think as a matter of social policy. I think children are a great source of joy and meaning, and I would recommend, other things being equal, I'd recommend that people have children rather than not. So I don't share this particular aversion or misanthropy of Schopenhauer, and that may make me a poor Schopenhauerian. I'm happy to read his text and to analyze it, but among the things I find value in his practical philosophy, the antinatalism is not one of them. I do think that if Schopenhauer had had children, had gotten married and had children himself, he might have been of a different mind, but then he wouldn't be the Arthur Schopenhauer that we know and admire. So that's my brief comment on natalism, just to put all my cards on the table. That's one place where I certainly part ways with Schopenhauer, both in my personal belief and in my general attitude towards life. So we may get to the metaphysical basis of that at some later time. But for now, let's take a look at the next section of this essay. In this part of the essay, Schopenhauer is going to compare the pleasures and pains of human beings to the pleasures and pains of animals, of beasts, with a certain kind of advantage held in some ways by the beasts. He's going to talk first about the difference that reason makes in our own experience of pleasure and pain. He's going to say a little bit about the role of time and self-consciousness in the life of a beast and the life of a human being. And he's going to conclude this passage with some thoughts about pets and domestic animals, and especially our affection for them as human beings dealing with lower animals in our daily lives. So here's what he writes. I shall be told, I suppose, that my philosophy is comfortless, because I speak the truth. And people prefer to be assured that everything the Lord has made is good. Go to the priests, then, and leave philosophers in peace. At any rate, do not ask us to accommodate our doctrines to the lessons you have been taught. That is what those rascals of sham philosophers will do for you. Ask them for any doctrine you please, and you will get it. Your university professors are bound to preach optimism, and it is an easy and agreeable task to upset their theories. I'll just say parenthetically here, he certainly has Hegel in mind and certain Hegelians who will provide a German idealist interpretation of the core doctrines of North German Protestantism. He may even have Kant in mind, although Schopenhauer does admire Kant immensely in other writings. So, going on. I have reminded the reader that every state of welfare, every feeling of satisfaction is negative in its character. That is to say, it consists in freedom from pain, which is the positive element of existence. It follows, therefore, that the happiness of any given life is to be measured not by its joys and pleasures, but by the extent to which it has been free from suffering, from positive evil. If this is the true standpoint, the lower animals appear to enjoy a happier destiny than man. Let us examine the matter a little more closely. However varied the forms that human happiness and misery may take, leading a man to seek the one and shun the other, the material basis of it all is bodily pleasure or bodily pain. This basis is very restricted. It is simply health, food, protection from wet and cold, the satisfaction of the sexual instinct, or else the absence of these things. Consequently, as far as real physical pleasure is concerned, the man is not better off than the brute, except insofar as the higher possibilities of his nervous system make him more sensitive to every kind of pleasure, but also, it must be remembered, to every kind of pain. But then, compared with the brute, how much stronger are the passions aroused in him? What an immeasurable difference there is in the depth and vehemence of his emotions. And yet, in the one case as in the other, all to produce the same result in the end, namely, health, food, clothing, and so on. The chief source of all this passion is that thought for what is absent and future, which, with man, exercises such a powerful influence upon all he does. It is this that is the real origin of his cares, his hopes, his fears, emotions which affect him much more deeply than could ever be the case with those present joys and sufferings to which the brute is confined. In his powers of reflection, memory, and foresight, man possesses, as it were, a machine for condensing and storing up his pleasures and his sorrows. But the brute has nothing of the kind. Whenever it is in pain, it is as though it were suffering for the first time, even though the same thing should have previously happened to it times out of number. It has no power of summing up its feelings. Hence its careless and placid temper, how much it is to be envied. But in man, reflection comes in, with all the emotions to which it gives rise, and taking up the same elements of pleasure and pain which are common to him and the brute, it develops his susceptibility to happiness and misery to such a degree that at one moment the man is brought in an instant to a state of delight that may even prove fatal, at another to depths of despair and suicide. Okay, so I'll pause for just a moment to review what we've talked about. We've heard here that the physical basis of human happiness and misery is identical with the beast. It is the satisfaction of physical desires and comforts. It's the removal of physical pain, which is the key element in life. But with human beings, this is complicated by our powers of reflection and intelligence, which give us this sort of curse of memory and anticipation. His description of this is very apt. It's like a machine for condensing and processing and holding on to our pleasures and sorrows. And we might note simply there, if the pleasures in the world are vastly outnumbered by the sorrows and miseries of the world, having concentrated versions of both is actually worse overall. So human beings capable of greater pleasures and of greater miseries, but on the whole, that means a more miserable life altogether. There's also something he's going to develop in the next pages, this suggestion that the consciousness of animals is limited to the immediate present moment, where with human beings, we are spread out over a wider period of time. And this is, again, to our detriment in the matter of actually acquiring happiness and release from misery and pain. So we'll go on with Schopenhauer now. If we carry our analysis a step farther, we shall find that, in order to increase his pleasures, man has intentionally added to the number and pressure of his needs, which in their original state were not much more difficult to satisfy than those of the brute. Hence, luxury in all its forms, delicate food, and the use of tobacco and opium, spirituous liquors, fine clothes, and the 1,001 things that he considers necessary to his existence. And above and beyond all this, there is a separate and peculiar source of pleasure, and consequently of pain, which man has established for himself, also as the result of using his powers of reflection, and this occupies him out of all proportion to its value, nay, almost more than all his other interests put together. I mean, ambition and the feeling of honor and shame. In plain words, what he thinks about the opinion other people have of him. Taking 1,000 forms, often very strange ones, this becomes the goal of almost all the efforts he makes that are not rooted in physical pleasure or pain. It is true that besides the sources of pleasure which he has in common with the brute, man has the pleasures of the mind as well. These admit of many gradations, from the most innocent, trifling, or the merest talk, up to the highest intellectual achievements. But there is the accompanying boredom to be set against them on the side of suffering. Boredom is a form of suffering unknown to brutes, at any rate in their natural state. It is only the very cleverest of them who show faint traces of it when they are domesticated. Whereas in the case of man, it has become a downright scourge. The crowd of miserable wretches, whose one aim in life is to fill their purses but never put anything into their heads, offers a singular instance of this torment of boredom. Their wealth becomes a punishment by delivering them up to misery of having nothing to do. For, to escape it, they will rush about in all directions, traveling here, there, and everywhere. No sooner do they arrive in a place than they are anxious to know what amusements it affords, just as though they were beggars asking where they could receive a dole. Of a truth, need and boredom are the two poles of human life. Finally, I may mention that as regards the sexual relation, a man is committed to a peculiar arrangement which drives him obstinately to choose one person. This feeling grows now and then into a more or less passionate love, which is the source of little pleasure and much suffering. Footnote. I have treated this subject at length in a special chapter of the second volume of my chief work. I'll pause there and note that's chapter 44 of part 2, volume 2 of The World as Will and Representation. I have looked into that earlier today, and I have to tell you there's a lot of fascinating stuff in there. It's titled On the Metaphysics of Sexual Love. We might take a look at that in a later video. It's some very provocative thoughts and suggestions from Schopenhauer in that chapter. But to take a look back at these past 2 pages, we find that human beings have not only to suffer the sort of curse of intelligence and self-consciousness, which magnifies their pains and magnifies their pleasures, meaning more pain overall, but they've also invented new needs, new things to be pained at the lack of. He mentions tobacco and alcohol and other things that we consider now to be necessary. So these are things the animals wouldn't even contemplate seeking, much less lamenting their lack of, but here it is. We have invented more suffering for ourselves by inventing these luxury goods. And then his discussion of the opinion that other people have of us. Sounds very Rousseauian in its own way, that because we care about other people's opinion of us, now here's another source of misery for us, another source of striving and struggle and anxiously seeking to sort of scratch an itch that we've given to ourselves now in the form of this social reality that we present ourselves at. And then this final discussion of boredom, again, that need and boredom are the two poles of human life. The suggestion that people now become wealthy and their wealth becomes a curse because they travel in order to find something to do, and then they seek like beggars for amusement, for what Pascal might call diversion, the minute that they arrive. Rather than being wealthy, they are most poor, we might say. They behave like people who are needy and scrabbling for scraps. So let's continue with Schopenhauer now. It is, however, a wonderful thing that the mere addition of thought should serve to raise such a vast and lofty structure of human happiness and misery, resting too on the same narrow basis of joy and sorrow as man holds in common with the brute, and exposing him to such violent emotions, to so many storms of passion, so much convulsion of feeling, that what he has suffered stands written and may be read in the lines of his face. And yet, when all is told, he has been struggling ultimately for the very same things as the brute has attained, and with an incomparably smaller expenditure of passion and pain. But all this contributes to increase the measures of suffering in human life out of all proportion to its pleasures, and the pains of life are made much worse for man by the fact that death is something very real to him. The brute flies from death instinctively without really knowing what it is, and therefore without ever contemplating it in the way natural to man, who has this prospect always before his eyes. So that even if only a few brutes die a natural death, and most of them live only just long enough to transmit their species, and then, if not earlier, become the prey of some other animal, whilst man on the other hand manages to make so-called natural death the rule, to which, however, there are a good many exceptions, the advantage is on the side of the brute, for the reasons stated above. But the fact that man attains the natural term of years just as seldom as the brute, but the fact is that man attains the natural term of years just as seldom as the brute, because the unnatural way in which he lives and the strain of work and emotion lead to a degeneration of the race, and so his goal is not often reached. The brute is much more content with mere existence than man. The plant is wholly so, and man finds satisfaction in it just in proportion as he is dull and obtuse. Accordingly, the life of the brute carries less of sorrow with it, but also less of joy, when compared with the life of man. And while this may be traced on the one side to freedom from the torment of care and anxiety, it is also due to the fact that hope, in any real sense, is unknown to the brute. It is thus deprived of any share in that which gives us the most and best of our joys and pleasures, the mental anticipation of a happy future, and the inspiring play of fantasy, both of which we owe to our power of imagination. If the brute is free from care, it is also in this sense without hope. In either case, because its consciousness is limited to the present moment, to what it can actually see before it. The brute is an embodiment of present impulses, and hence what elements of fear and hope exist in its nature, and they do not go very far, arise only in relation to objects that lie before it and within reach of those impulses. Whereas a man's range of vision embraces the whole of his life and extends far into the past and future. Following upon this, there is one respect in which brutes show real wisdom when compared with us. I mean their quiet, placid enjoyment of the present moment. The tranquility of mind which this seems to give them often puts us to shame for the many times we allow our thoughts and our cares to make us restless and discontented. And in fact, those pleasures of hope and anticipation which I have been mentioning are not to be had for nothing. The delight which a man has in hoping for and looking forward to some special satisfaction is a part of the real pleasure attaching to it enjoyed in advance. This is afterwards deducted, for the more we look forward to anything, the less satisfaction we find when it comes. But the brute's enjoyment is not anticipated, and therefore suffers no deduction, so that the actual pleasure of the moment comes to it whole and unimpaired. In the same way, too, evil presses upon the brute only with its own intrinsic weight, whereas with us, the fear of its coming often makes its burden 10 times more grievous. So, here is a bit more about the difference between humans and animals in regards to pleasure and pain, the difference that self-consciousness and consciousness of the past and the future, consciousness of one's own death makes. This makes us capable of far more miseries, also of hope, which is a source of pleasure. Or we might also say of dashed hope, which is a source of misery. It seems to me that one way to think about this may be that just as animals lack a theory of mind for us, right? My dog doesn't really have a sense of me as a mind like its own looking back. Just as animals don't have a theory of mind for humans, animals don't really have a theory of mind for themselves. They don't really have a sense of themselves as enduring across time, as having experiences. I'm not going to try to explain just what I mean by that. If it resonates with you, then run with it. So this awareness of death is another source of uniquely human source of misery. I do think that while Schopenhauer is correct about animals as the kind of distillation, the sort of the embodiment of the present tense, so that the things immediately in front of them are their only source, and sort of maybe in the immediate past and immediate future are their only source of attention and therefore of pleasure and misery, often to their great benefit relative to us. I do think he's mistaken about this idea that anticipation and the pleasure of anticipation deducts from the actual enjoyment of the thing once it is achieved. I don't think I've found that to be the case in my own life, that the more I anticipate something, the less I enjoy it once I achieve it. I think Schopenhauer maybe has either made just a straight up mistake in describing human psychology, or he's maybe been lured by the desire to make a certain point, something like a point he made in Counsels and Maxims about the way in which we sort of take an advance upon certain goods that are coming to us in the future. So, from my own perspective, I would say I think he's probably wrong about that. So let's go back onto the text and finish this section. It is just this characteristic way in which the brute gives itself up entirely to the present moment that contributes so much to the delight we take in our domestic pets. They are the present moment personified, and in some respects they make us feel the value of every hour that is free from trouble and annoyance, which we, with our thoughts and preoccupations, mostly disregard. But man, that selfish and heartless creature, misuses this quality of the brute to be more content than we are with mere existence, and often works it to such an extent that he allows the brute absolutely nothing more than mere bare life. The bird which was made so that it might rove over half the world, he shuts up into the space of a cubic foot, there to die a slow death in longing and crying for freedom, for in a cage it does not sing for the pleasure of it. And when I see how man misuses the dog, his best friend, how he ties up this intelligent animal with a chain, I feel the deepest sympathy with the brute and burning indignation against its master. We shall see later that by taking a very high standpoint, it is possible to justify the sufferings of mankind. But this justification cannot apply to animals, whose sufferings, while in a great measure brought about by men, are often considerable even apart from their agency. And so we are forced to ask, why and for what purpose does all this torment and agony exist? There is nothing here to give the will pause. It is not free to deny itself and so obtain redemption. There is only one consideration that may serve to explain the sufferings of animals. It is this, that the will to live, which underlies the whole world of phenomena, must in their case satisfy its cravings by feeding upon itself. This it does by forming a gradation of phenomena, every one of which exists at the expense of another. I have shown, however, that the capacity for suffering is less in animals than in man. Any further explanation that may be given of their fate will be in the nature of hypothesis, if not actually mythical in its character, and I may leave the reader to speculate upon the matter for himself. That's all I'm going to read from On the Sufferings of the World for today, but some thoughts about the attitude that we take, the pleasures and pains we take, the joys and delights that we take in the lives of our domestic animals, of our pets. It is precisely because they lack our particular anxiety, our hopes and memories that we find them so attractive and comforting to live with. It also indicates that there's a way in which their pleasures are kind of pure pleasures that we wish we could enjoy in the way that they do. And their pains, especially when they're inflicted by human beings, seem to be far more terrible and less justifiable. So there is this discussion here, getting a little bit into Schopenhauer's metaphysics, that the will at the animal level, at the brute level, is just self-consuming because it doesn't have the capability of rising up to any sort of greater act of redemption or self-understanding. So the animals doesn't have the psychological complexity to seek a kind of philosophical self-denial and self-annihilation. And so it has to simply go on being what it is, suffering in the way that it suffers, which is limited, thankfully, until its natural end. So those are the middle pages of Schopenhauer's essay on the sufferings of the world. I hope you've enjoyed my commentary on them. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.